On December 27, 2023, South Korea woke up to a silence that felt heavier than ordinary grief. Lee Sun-kyun had been found dead in a car in Seoul. He was 48 years old. For many people, the first feeling was not just sadness, but disbelief. This was the same man whose calm face, low voice, and restrained performances had become familiar to millions through Korean cinema and television. To global audiences, he was the father from Parasite, the elegant man at the center of a film that changed the history of Korean cinema. To Korean viewers, he was much more than that. A trusted actor, a serious performer, a presence that carried intelligence and quiet authority. That is why the news hit so hard. It did not feel like the fall of a reckless celebrity. It felt like the sudden loss of someone who had always seemed composed, controlled, and deeply adult. And because his death came after months of scandal, interrogation, and public humiliation, the shock carried something darker than mourning. It carried shame, anger, and the uneasy feeling that everyone had watched a man being pushed toward the edge in real time. What made the tragedy even more disturbing was the contrast between Lee Sun-kyun's public image and the ending that finally came. He was not known for chaos. He was known for stillness. On screen, he often played men who held themselves together even when life was collapsing around them. There was dignity in the way he moved, spoke, and carried silence. That is one reason his death felt so cruelly symbolic. In the final months of his life, the same man once admired for his calm was dragged into a public storm that seemed designed to strip away dignity piece by piece. Cameras followed him to police stations, headlines multiplied, speculation spread faster than facts. The scandal became louder than the person. And somewhere inside all of that noise was a human being who had once stood on some of the highest stages in the industry, now reduced to a figure surrounded by accusation, scrutiny, and a society that seemed unable to look away. The actor who had mastered emotional restraint on screen was forced into a real-life spectacle he could not fully control. But the story of Lee Sun-kyun is not only the story of a scandal or a death, it is the story of a man whose strength was always quieter than the world around him, and whose real collapse only became visible when it was already too late. To understand why his death felt so devastating, we have to go back before the headlines, before the police questioning, before the public unraveling. We have to go back to the young man who built a career not through noise or aggression, but through precision, trust, and emotional intelligence. Because Lee Sun-kyun did not become a tragedy overnight, he became one after a lifetime of carrying calm so convincingly that people forgot calm can also be a form of strain. And once a society starts confusing restraint with invulnerability, it becomes much easier to miss the breaking point until the silence is final. Long before the scandal, before the headlines, before the global fame that would one day tie his face forever to Parasite, Lee Sun-kyun was a boy growing up in South Korea, with a presence that would later become his signature: calm, thoughtful, and quietly observant. He was not the kind of future star whose story begins with loud ambition or immediate spectacle. His energy was different. Even later in life, what made him stand out was not flamboyance, but gravity, the sense that something deeper was always happening underneath the surface. That quality rarely appears from nowhere. It is often formed early, in temperament, in solitude, in the way a person learns to move through the world before the world begins watching. Lee did not seem built for noise. He seemed built for interiority. That is what would later make him such a powerful actor. He understood silence. He understood what people hide. He understood how much can live inside a face when almost nothing is being said. Before the industry knew his name, he already carried the kind of stillness that would one day make audiences trust him instinctively. As he grew older, that natural restraint became part of his path into acting. Lee Sun-kyun studied at the Korea National University of Arts, one of the most respected training grounds for performers in South Korea. That detail matters because it places him not in the category of celebrity manufactured for visibility, but in the tradition of actors shaped by craft, discipline, and artistic seriousness. He did not arrive in entertainment as a polished fantasy. He arrived as someone learning the work from the inside. In the early years, he moved through smaller roles, supporting parts, and the slow climb so many serious actors know well. Nothing about his rise suggests instant myth, and that, in a way, is what makes it so compelling. Lee built his career gradually, through reliability, depth, and the kind of screen presence that grows stronger the longer you watch it. He was not a performer who forced you to notice him. He earned attention through control. His voice helped too. That low, resonant tone that could sound comforting, intelligent, tired, authoritative, or wounded depending on how he used it. Long before international audiences would recognize it, that voice was already becoming part of his power. That is why the early life of Lee Sun-kyun matters so much in the story that followed. He was not simply a handsome actor who later became famous. He was a person whose entire artistic identity was built on emotional restraint, careful expression, and the ability to suggest hidden life beneath an ordinary surface. Those gifts brought him admiration, but they may also have made it easier for the world to misunderstand him later. When someone seems calm, people often assume calm is what they feel. When someone appears controlled, people forget that control can take enormous effort. And when someone becomes known for quiet strength, the world can become blind to the cost of carrying that image for too long. Before Lee Sun-kyun became the man audiences saw in dramas, films, red carpets, interviews, and global press, he was already becoming the kind of person who would hold everything inside until the silence itself began to speak. Before the fame, there was the boy with the calm voice, and perhaps that calm was never as simple as it looked. Lee Sun-kyun's rise did not happen with the loud force of celebrity built for instant obsession. It happened the way some of the most respected careers happen, slowly, convincingly, and with the kind of consistency that makes audiences trust a face before they even realize how attached they have become to it. In the early years, he moved through Korean television and film with a quiet confidence that set him apart from more visibly dramatic performers. He did not demand attention with excess. He pulled people in through precision. As his roles grew, so did the feeling that he belonged to a rare category of actor, someone who could make intelligence visible without becoming cold, someone who could carry exhaustion, tenderness, frustration, and dignity all in the same expression. By the time viewers saw him in projects like Coffee Prince and Pasta, Lee was no longer just another working actor. He had become recognizable in a deeper way. He felt dependable, and in screen acting, dependability can become its own kind of stardom. Audiences began to understand that if Lee Sun-kyun was in a scene, there would be weight inside it, emotional weight, moral tension, or simply the sense that something real was happening underneath the dialogue. That trust became even stronger with My Mr., one of the performances that defined him for a generation of viewers. In that role, Lee did something extraordinary. He made weariness feel noble without turning it into self-pity. He played a man carrying the slow collapse of ordinary life, and he did it with such restraint that the pain never had to announce itself loudly. It simply existed in him, in the way his shoulders moved, in the way his silence lingered, in the way every word seemed to come from someplace tired, but still human. That is what made Lee Sun-kyun so powerful. He understood that some of the deepest suffering is not explosive. It is quiet. It survives inside routine, responsibility, marriage, work, and the effort to keep going when everything feels heavier than it should. That understanding gave him a kind of emotional authority few actors ever fully develop. Then came Parasite, and the world finally caught up to what Korean audiences had already known for years. As Park Dong-ik, the wealthy father in Bong Joon-ho's film, Lee became part of a cultural event that shattered boundaries and changed the international perception of Korean cinema forever. Parasite did not just win awards, it won history, and Lee's presence inside it mattered. He brought an essential stillness to the film's tension, polished, controlled, slightly distant but never empty. The role reached global audiences, but the artistry behind it had been building for decades. Suddenly, the man whose talent had grown in the quiet language of Korean acting was standing inside an Oscar-winning masterpiece seen all over the world. And yet the most tragic part of Lee Sun-kyun's rise is that just when the world could see him most clearly, his life began to darken in a way that had nothing to do with craft. After Parasite, he was not simply successful. He had crossed into a rarer kind of recognition, not idle fame, not temporary international curiosity, but real artistic visibility on a global scale. Projects like Dr. Brain suggested his career was continuing to expand outward, that he was entering a stage where Korean actors could move more freely between local prestige and international reach. He had become, in many ways, the face of a mature, modern Korean acting tradition, understated, intelligent, emotionally disciplined, and impossible to dismiss. That is why what happened later feels so cruel. Lee was not fading when the pressure came. He was not a forgotten figure clinging to relevance. He was still very much present, still respected, still carrying the calm authority that had defined his best work. And perhaps that is what makes the fall so devastating. The man at the center of the scandal was not simply famous. He was someone whose entire career had been built on emotional control, dignity, and trust. The public had spent years learning to believe his stillness, and when the noise of the real world finally overwhelmed it, the loss struck with a force far beyond ordinary celebrity tragedy. What destroyed the final chapter of Lee Sun-kyun's life was not only accusation, it was exposure. By late 2023, he was no longer being seen first as an actor, a husband, or a man with decades of work behind him. He was being consumed as a scandal. Once his name became tied to a drug investigation, the machinery around public shame moved with terrifying speed. Headlines multiplied, speculation spread, cameras waited. Every appearance at a police station turned into another image for the public to judge. Lee was questioned again and again, and the process itself became spectacle. In South Korea, scandals involving celebrities do not stay private for long, but in his case, the level of exposure felt relentless. The details of his personal life were dragged into public conversation, and the investigation began to erase everything else people once associated with him. This is the cruelty at the center of the story. The same culture that had admired his dignity now watched that dignity being stripped away in real time, under lights brighter and harsher than any film set he had ever stood on. What made the situation even darker was that the scandal did not unfold in a world that knew how to wait for nuance. It unfolded inside a system where suspicion can become punishment before truth has settled. Lee maintained that he had been deceived, and tests reportedly came back negative, but by then the noise around him had already taken on a life of its own. Public opinion does not always move with evidence. Sometimes it moves with humiliation, and humiliation, once televised, can become impossible to contain. That is why this chapter cannot be told simply as a scandal happened. It has to be told as a slow crushing. A man known for restraint was forced into a series of public appearances where the cameras were not looking for truth or complexity. They were looking for damage. They were looking for collapse. The actor whose entire power came from subtlety was thrown into a culture of spectacle that rewards certainty, outrage, and shame. In a cruel way, the public no longer wanted the man it had admired. It wanted the scandal version of him, flattened into something easier to consume. That is what makes Lee Sun-kyun's case feel larger than one man alone. After his death, the backlash was not just grief, it was discomfort, anger, reflection. People began asking whether the investigation had become too public, whether the media had crossed a line, whether a society that claims to value dignity had instead participated in destroying it. Because by the end, Lee was not simply living under pressure, he was being cornered by it. His private life had become public theater, and the punishment of being seen that way may have grown heavier than the facts themselves. That does not erase complexity, but it changes the emotional truth of the story. Lee Sun-kyun did not fall apart in secret. He was worn down where everyone could watch, and when a man whose whole life has been built on quiet control is forced to endure that kind of public unraveling, the silence that follows can become fatal.
On the morning of December 27, 2023, Lee Sun-kyun left home and did not return. He left behind a note, and not long after he was found dead inside a car in central Seoul. He was 48 years old. The details of that morning quickly became national news, but what made the tragedy feel so devastating was how quickly the noise around his life was replaced by a different kind of silence. For weeks and months, the public had been watching his name dragged through scandal, questioning, headlines, and suspicion. Then suddenly, all of that collapsed into one irreversible fact. He was gone. The man who had once seemed so steady on screen had reached a place in real life where steadiness no longer held. And that is what makes the ending so painful. His death did not arrive after years of public decline. It arrived after a concentrated season of shame, pressure, and exposure that seemed to swallow his whole identity in a matter of weeks. In the end, Lee Sun-kyun was not only escaping scandal, he was escaping a world that no longer seemed willing to let him remain a person inside it. The funeral made that loss visible in a way headlines never could. Family, close friends, and fellow actors gathered in Seoul to say goodbye, and the atmosphere around the funeral was heavy, not only with grief, but with unfinished feeling. The images were quiet, but devastating. Mourners arriving in black, eyes lowered, faces strained, the hearse moving slowly, the private sorrow of a family forced into public tragedy. There were no grand speeches that could explain what had happened. There was only the terrible contrast between the man audiences knew through his work and the way his life had ended under pressure. The funeral mattered because it returned him, however briefly, from scandal to humanity. He was no longer a headline, no longer an accusation, no longer a public controversy. He was a son, a husband, a father, a colleague, a friend. That shift is what makes the images from those days so painful to watch. Public scandal reduces people to symbols. Funerals restore the truth that symbols are still human beings with names, families, and people who loved them before the world turned them into a story. And yet Lee Sun-kyun's story cannot end with scandal, because scandal is the noisiest part of his ending, not the truest part of his life. What remains after the noise is the work, the voice, the face, the performances, the exhausted dignity of My Mister, the controlled distance of Parasite. The years he spent proving that an actor does not need loud gestures to leave a permanent mark. That is why his death continues to hurt. Not only because it was tragic, and not only because it exposed something cruel in the machinery of public shame, but because it happened to a man whose art was built on restraint, intelligence, and emotional depth. Lee Sun-kyun mattered because he made stillness unforgettable. He made ordinary weariness profound. He made quiet men visible. Long after the scandal loses its immediate heat, that is what will survive. The final noise around his name may have been brutal, but it will not be the last word. In the end, what remains is not the interrogation room, not the headlines, not the cameras outside the police station. What remains is the actor, and the unbearable truth that the world recognized his humanity most clearly only after it had helped crush it.